Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are stepping into the ring for, well, one of the oldest and most intense intellectual battles in history.
The big one.
The big one, the problem of evil. But, and this is key with a very specific twist, we're looking at a debate between conservative heavyweight Ben Shapiro and atheist philosopher Alex O'Connor. And the core question is just, it's terrifyingly simple. If God is moral, why does the Bible provide instructions on how to own slaves?
That's a huge question.
We're exploring the clash between, divine commands and human ethics, and asking whether a perfect God can operate through a very imperfect history.
And it's a massive topic. So to ground everyone before we really jump in, it's important to realize this isn't just, a theological spat.
Right.
It's really a case study on how we read ancient texts. We're analyzing a very specific debate about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the morality of slavery, and ultimately, the nature of God's power itself.
Yeah. And actually, before we go any further, I have a quick message for our global audience who have been asking how to support the show. So for you, I've been asked to say this. Kanalımı beğendiyseniz lütfen abone olunuz ve beğen tuşuna basınız. Okay, let's unpack this. Because usually when people talk about the Bible and slavery, it's all very vague.
Yeah, they just wave it away.
They just say, oh, it was a different time, and then, leave it at that. But Alex O'Connor, the atheist in this debate, he starts with a very direct challenge. He says you have to take religious scripture at face value.
You have to.
He argues the Bible doesn't just, hint at slavery.
Right.
It contains specific legalistic commandments on how to do it.
That is the crux of his opening. O'Connor's point is that these texts, they aren't just ambiguous historical records. They are prescriptive. They are instructions.
A how-to manual.
Exactly. And he argues these specific commands explicitly hindered abolition later in history. If you have a holy book giving you the manual on how to buy and discipline people, it makes it incredibly difficult for later generations to argue that the whole thing is evil.
You're fighting your own God's rule book.
You really are.
So how does Ben Shapiro handle that?
Yeah.
Well, he's an Orthodox Jew. He can't just say the book is wrong.
No, he certainly can't. And this is where Shapiro introduces a concept he calls imagination.
Imagination.
Yeah.
That sounds a little abstract for a debate about slavery.
It does, but he's using it in a philosophical sense. Shapiro's argument is that we need to use our imagination to step outside our modern framework and understand that God isn't a human. He doesn't operate with human logic.
Okay.
But more importantly, he says the Bible is in what he calls a problematic position.
Problematic how?
Well, Shapiro argues that the Bible is trying to do two contradictory things at the same time. On one hand, it's trying to reveal these eternal, objective truths.
For all time.
Right. But on the other hand, it's speaking to a very specific group of people at a very specific time. We're talking Bronze Age, Iron Age.
So he's saying the software of the Bible had to run on the hardware of 1000 BC humanity.
That's a perfect way to put it, yes. And to bolster this, he compares it directly to Hammurabi's code, the law in Babylon.
Which was from around the same time.
Exactly. And he points out that back then, slavery was universal. It wasn't just common. It was the metabolic rate of the economy. Even Aristotle later defended it. So Shapiro's big argument is that the Bible was actually a liberalizing force.
Liberalizing. That feels like a massive stretch when you're talking about owning another human being. How can you call a book that regulates slavery liberal?
The argument is entirely relative. Shapiro says if you look at the Bible next to something like Hammurabi's code, the biblical laws made slavery harsher for the owner.
Harsher for the owner.
Yes, and more difficult to maintain. For example, in Babylon, if you hid an escaped slave, that was a death sentence. In the Bible, there's a command not to return a fugitive slave to their master.
I see. So the defense is, we were better than the neighbors. But that's the tension for me, and I think O'Connor just nails this. Is better than the neighbors a good enough excuse for God?
Exactly. If you're the source of morality, do you really grade on a curve?
Right.
And that leads us straight into the second major argument, which is this theory of gradualism versus divine power. Shapiro relies really heavily on this theological idea of wooing.
Wooing, like courting someone.
In a theological sense, yes. Shapiro argues God tries to woo people away from sin rather than just banning it outright. The whole idea is that humans in 1000 BC, they just weren't capable of following a command to completely abolish their entire economic structure.
He thinks society would have just collapsed.
Either collapsed or, more likely, they would have just rejected the revelation entirely. So it's a pragmatic approach. God meets people where they are.
But O'Connor's not buying that for a second. And this is where the debate gets really sharp, because he attacks the consistency of that logic.
He does.
O'Connor asks, If God is God, why does he care about social discohesion?
It's a fair question. Why would an omnipotent being worry about the economy?
Right. And O'Connor points out God was perfectly willing to ban other things entirely. Witchcraft, eating shellfish. He just said, nope, cut it out. I don't care if you like shrimp, stop eating it. So O'Connor asks the killer question. Why could God ban shrimp, but not slavery? Why is the diet so strict, but the human rights violations are just gradual?
That is the strongest arrow in O'Connor's quiver. He argues that God should not permit what he calls flat immorality, regardless of the time period. If you can say don't eat pork, you can definitely say don't own people.
And by allowing it, even gradually, God is complicit.
That's the argument. And Shapiro actually has to concede some ground here.
He does. That's surprising.
Well, he admits that by the standards of the Judeo-Christian tradition today, holding a slave is immoral. He's not defending the practice as a good thing, but he doubles down on the idea that God had to speak to humans on a level they could understand. He's basically saying the moral operating system of humanity needed an upgrade before it could run the abolition software.
Which brings us to the really gritty details. Because it's one thing to talk about slavery as an abstract concept. It's another to read the actual verses.
And this is where O'Connor brings the receipts. He pulls out Deuteronomy and Numbers 31.
Yeah, these are the texts that make everyone uncomfortable, to put it mildly. These are instructions for laying siege to cities. Kill the men, keep the women and children as plunder. And then there's the rule about the beautiful captive.
The Aishit Yifat Tor.
Right. The rule says if a soldier sees a beautiful captive, he can take her. But he has to shave her head, cut her nails, let her mourn for a month. Then he can marry her.
And O'Connor also brings up the slaughter of the Midianites, where they killed everyone except the virgins who were kept for the soldiers. It's brutal stuff.
And O'Connor just asks, how is this liberalizing? This sounds like state-sanctioned war crimes.
And Shapiro has a defense for this, which, I mean, it's fascinating. He calls it the anti-rape theory.
Ooh, anti-rape theory.
Yes. Drawing on Talmudic tradition, he says we have to look at the alternative. He's asking us to be realists about ancient warfare. The default human behavior then, and even now, is mass rape. He actually cites the Russian army entering Germany in World War II.
So his argument is these laws were actually restrictions, putting speed bumps in front of soldiers.
Precisely. He's arguing the Bible forces a soldier to pause. You see a captive, you can't just take her right there in the heat of battle. You have to take her home, shave her head, make her unappealing, give her a month to mourn.
It's a utilitarian argument. I can't stop you from sinning, so I'm going to make it really bureaucratic and annoying to sin.
That's a very good way to put it, yes. He claims it was designed to cool the bloodlust and force soldiers to treat these captives as wives, not just objects.
But O'Connor pushes back hard on this. He asks, okay, but why does that protection only apply to the virgins? And fundamentally, his point is that treating humans as plunder is inherently immoral, period. You're still just arguing about the correct way to own a person.
And that's a valid skepticism. O'Connor isn't buying that a perfect God has to settle for less rape. He thinks a perfect God should demand no rape.
Which leads to what I think was the aha moment of the whole thing. A specific loophole O'Connor finds in Exodus 21.
This is a crucial part of the debate. The law says a Hebrew slave goes free after 7 years, which, on the surface, sounds progressive. A term limit.
Right, like indentured servitude. But there's a catch. A huge catch. If the master gave the slave a wife and they had kids, the slave goes free, but the wife and kids belong to the master.
The family is split. The man is free, but his family remains property.
And he's faced with this horrific choice, the ear-piercing ceremony. He can leave free and alone, or have his ear pierced with an awl against a doorpost and declare himself a slave for life to stay with his family.
It's a devastating ultimatum, freedom or family.
And O'Connor pounces on this. This is where he dismantles the gradualism defense. He says, look, we're not talking about overturning the global economy here.
No.
He argues that God could have just said, let the family go too.
And that's his strongest practical argument. He's saying, okay, Ben, I'll accept your gradualism, but this is a minor improvement. Letting a wife and kids leave with their husband wouldn't crash the Bronze Age economy.
It's just a small tweak that prevents a family from being torn apart. Why couldn't an all-powerful God make that one little edit?
It cuts right through the theological noise. It's so specific.
So what can Shapiro say to that? It seems so obviously fixable.
And his response here is really telling. He actually admits that if he accepts O'Connor's premise that it is a simple fix, then the conclusion follows that it's an immorality. It looks like a mistake.
So does he concede?
Not entirely. He retreats. He retreats to the complexity of incentive structures.
Oh boy.
He argues we can't know the economic fallout. He speculates, maybe if masters knew they'd lose the wife and kids, they wouldn't let slaves marry at all. Maybe they'd treat them worse.
So he's saying it's complicated, and we can't know the mind of God or the economics of 1000 BC.
He is. And it feels like a retreat from the stronger theological arguments. The gradualism argument starts to look a bit thin when you zoom in that close.
And speaking of modern morality, that brings us to the meta debate that's happening underneath all of this.
The accusation of moral relativism.
Yes. And this was a fascinating flip of the script.
It really was. Usually it's the religious person calling the atheist a relativist. No God, no objective morality.
But here, O'Connor accuses Shapiro of being the moral relativist. He's saying, you're arguing slavery was okay then, but wrong now. That is the definition of relativism.
Exactly. O'Connor holds the line, slavery is always wrong, period. If God said it was okay then, God was wrong. But Shapiro reverses this, and it's brilliant.
How does he do it?
He argues that O'Connor is, and this is a great phrase, living off the remains of the Judeo-Christian tradition. He asks O'Connor, where do you get the idea that slavery is wrong in the first place?
Oh, that is a quiz.
Shapiro claims that O'Connor's very ability to judge slavery as immoral comes from the Bible's long-term influence. Specifically, the idea of imago Dei, that humans are made in God's image.
So he's saying, you're using my book's values to attack my book.
Precisely. In the ancient world, no one thought slavery was wrong. It was just nature. Strong rules the weak. He argues that without the Bible introducing this radical idea that every human has infinite value, we'd still be thinking like Aristotle, that some people are just born to be tools.
So the Bible planted the seeds that eventually grew into the tree of abolition, even if the seed itself looked ugly.
That's the metaphor. Shapiro sees the Bible not just as the written text, but as this living system, with the oral tradition, the Talmud interpreting and refining these laws over time. Progressive revelation.
So you have a stalemate. O'Connor sees a book that failed to be perfect and therefore can't be from a perfect God.
And Shapiro sees a book designed to enter a brutal world and slowly drag humanity, kicking and screaming toward morality.
But if the text requires thousands of years of human rabbis to fix it, is it really the perfect word of God? Or are we just fixing God's mistakes?
And that is the question every listener has to answer for themselves. Is the Bible a book of statutes for all time, or a record of humanity's slow, painful climb?
It really makes you think about our own time. Because if Shapiro is right, immorality evolves while God plays the long game.
And this is where it gets really uncomfortable for us.
Exactly. If we accept that premise, then here's the thought I want to leave you with. What practices are we doing today, right now, that we think are totally normal, that our descendants will look back on in 2,000 years with horror? Will they look at our factory farming, our wealth inequality? Will they ask, how could their gods possibly have allowed that? Are we the Bronze Age people of the future?
That's a terrifying thought, that we might be the barbarians we're criticizing.
It is. Thanks for thinking deeper with us.